Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Hugh Lane Gallery's Coffee Conversation series. My name is Kimberly Griffith, and I'm an artist and art historian on the Hugh Lane's panel of artist guides and lecturers. And I'm here today to talk to you about a painting that we have in the collection by the artist Ann Madden. The painting we'll be looking at today is called Icarus Plummet, and as I mentioned, it's by Ann Madden, who is really a central figure in the story of abstract painting in Ireland, and is also a more contemporary link in a long line of women artists in Ireland who were really at the forefront of bringing artistic innovation to Ireland and modern ideas in art making to Ireland. So without further ado, I'll go ahead and minimize myself now, and we can take a closer look at her paintings. So here we have Icarus Plummet, which was painted by Ann Madden in 1997. It's an oil-on canvas measuring 194 by 114 by 3 centimeters. It was presented to the gallery by Ann Madden in 1998. And I think to begin with, we might take a look at what we would call Ann Madden's physical involvement with her paintings. So, for example, this painting is 194 centimeters tall, as I've mentioned, so it's just under 2 meters, or about 6.5 feet tall, and has a width again of about 114 centimeters. So we might imagine it as about the size of a large, tall person, so quite an imposing presence in terms of size and scale. The dimensions of Ann Madden's large-scale works are defined by her height and reach, and the gestures of these paintings, so the brush strokes, indicate that she is making large brush strokes from her shoulder to her elbow. In terms of compositional technique, the work is rather uncomplicated, as we see the simple, abstracted figure of Icarus plummeting down through the bottom third of the canvas in his untimely descent from the heavens. The bright white streak in the bottom third of the canvas is topped in dashes of red and just a bit of gold, which recall remnants perhaps of the gold sun that, as the Greek myth tells us, Icarus flew too close to. Other than this abstracted detail of Icarus mid-plummet, we are swallowed up in the layers of ultramarine blue and azure that cover the majority of the canvas, a link both to the sky through which Icarus plummets and the sea that ultimately engulfs him. As you might have guessed by now, one of Ann Madden's main influences and sources of inspiration is Greek mythology, these archetypal myths that so many different human cultures are aware of and keep retelling as history has progressed. We'll talk a little bit more about these interests and how they developed in just a moment, but I'd like to start by sort of rewinding and taking a look at Ann Madden's earlier life and her development as an artist. So we'll do that now. Ann Madden was born in London in 1932 to Irish and Anglo-Chilean parents. Though her parents were living in Chile at the time, her mother traveled to London specifically to give birth to Ann Madden, undertaking an arduous ocean voyage while she was pregnant, presumably so that Ann Madden would have British citizenship. She spent her early years then in Chile before her family moved to England and then ultimately to Ireland in 1945. During these early years, Ann Madden met a young Chinese calligrapher and has said that this event first sparked her interest in painting. Following these aspirations, then, Madden attended the Chelsea School of Arts and Crafts from 1950 to 1952. The early self-portrait that we're looking at here from 1950 then comes from this period of schooling. Madden has said of her time at the Chelsea School of Art that the instruction was strictly traditional, and though perhaps technically useful, her time there is not much reflected in her compositions, both in this one and the ones to follow. What we do see here, I think, though, is some of the earliest inklings of influences that would become important artistic inspirations to her throughout the development of her career. So in my opinion, you can see an influence here both of Whistler in the restrained color palette and the sort of almost not monotone but sort of muted color palette, as well as the influence of Matisse, who has been a strong influence for Madden throughout her career. Later we see him influencing her color palette, but here I think that you do see a slight maybe nod or inkling of an early influence to Matisse in the way that she's dealing with the figure of her face and the human figure in the way that it's sort of flattened. In the artist's teen years, she suffered from a riding accident that had her bedridden for approximately 3 years. And though at the time she recovered from this accident, it would come back to haunt her later in life. In 1956, Anne Madden met one of Ireland's most famous artists, Louis Le Brocq, but shortly thereafter she re-injured her spine and had to undergo a series of spinal operations in the late 1950s, in which she ultimately spent a year in a hospital encased in plaster. And just to say that this event, not only did it have a profound impact on Anne Madden's life and artistic career in that she wasn't able to paint herself for quite some time during these operations, but it also had a profound impact on Louis Le Brocq's paintings at the time too, and his canvases from around this time period often display a spine as the only bodily presence that we can make out in them, and also have a texture similar to that of plaster. In 1958, though, Anne Madden and Louis Le Brocq were married, and they moved to the south of France, where they spent the next 30 or so years of their lives together. Around 1976, they began dividing their time between France and Ireland, and ultimately they moved more permanently back to Ireland in, I believe it was 2000. It was after this marriage to Louis Le Brocq that Anne Madden had recovered and was able to paint again regularly and for a sustained period, following a series of spinal operations that happened as a result of all of this. So by the time Anne Madden was really able to actively paint again as an artist, we've moved into the early 1960s now, and we begin to see her Irish roots and her time in a specific landscape in particular come to influence her early abstract paintings from this period. The sense of confidence and possibility that was pervasive in the culture of the 60s at the time in many countries gave many different artists, and many Irish artists in particular, the sense of freedom to work independently, and many artists like Madden were, as a result, led back to their own heritage. Before moving to Ireland with her family from the age of 13, Madden often went on family holidays as a child to the Burren in County Clare. This became an important source of inspiration in her painting, and she began to revisit it around this time. It was a most extraordinary country then, she recalled. It was like coming to a rainy Greece, especially then, when everybody was in shawls and without shoes. I fell in love immediately. I felt like I'm made of the same stuff as the Burren. It's very peculiar, but I love that place. Anne Madden's early abstract expressionist landscapes were inspired by the landscape of the Burren, and one result or feature of this is that many include actual sand and grit mixed into the paint, and to describe it as a sort of granite-like surface. So we see her trying to kind of replicate the environment of the Burren in an abstract expressionist fashion. These early abstract expressionist landscapes were also partially inspired by an exhibition that Anne Madden saw in 1956. It was an exhibition of New American painting at the Royal Academy in London, and it had a huge impact on her, giving her an impetus to move away from figurative representation into abstract representation, and allowed her to think of landscapes in an abstract manner, like this painting of the Burren that we're looking at right now. This canvas in particular is called Slieve Carron, and it was painted by Anne Madden in 1963. And it was in the 60s as well that Anne Madden began, I believe for the first time, painting on large-scale canvases as well. Often these were diptych, triptych, or multiples of canvases. And these fluid, light-filled, organic forms that filled the canvases and were inspired by rock and land masses firmly established Anne Madden as one of the leading abstract artists in Ireland. She won the first ever Carroll's Award at the Irish Exhibition of Living Art in 1964 and went on to represent Ireland in the Paris Biennial in 1965. As we trace Anne Madden's oeuvre of painting further into the 1960s, we begin to see her start to experiment with color as well, and these light-filled, fluid paintings of rock and land formations become imbued with a sense of color and have this sort of extra layer of vibrancy as a result of this. The art critic and artist Brian O'Doherty describes Anne Madden as in the company with other artists like Jack B. Yeats and William Leach as one of the greatest colorists that Ireland has ever produced. And it was another exhibition of New American painting, this time in 1959, that Anne Madden saw at the Tate Museum in London, which sort of inspired her and sparked this interest to start moving into working in color and playing with color as an artistic medium. This exhibition of New American painting was hugely influential on Anne Madden in terms of the scale, the intensity of color, and the sense that these elements evoked a sense of excitement and freedom at a time when there seemed to be little emerging from the established centers of art outside of America. So this is also the first time that American art and artists began to have a big impact on the international scene, and as a result of her being exposed to these new innovations in painting, Anne Madden became greatly affected by these movements and ideas. This is also where she came into contact with the artist Mark Rothko for the first time. And Rothko's color field paintings in particular had a lasting impact on Anne Madden's artistic development as well. In the late 1960s, then, she continues to experiment with pouring paint directly onto the canvas, which was spread out on the floor in front of her. And we see examples of this in Quadriparty Mountain Sequence Red, which we're looking at here, as well as in the canvas that we just looked at in the Burren. So the canvas that depicts the Burren. So the process here would be that the canvas would be on the floor and she'd be sort of pouring paint onto them in an experimental fashion, which was also similar to and in line with innovations that were happening in the abstract expressionist school at the time. The work that we're looking at here is also a great example of the division of her canvases and the way that she would divide and combine different canvases together to make an overall work. And it's thought that these sort of divisions between the canvases might also reflect the divisions in the natural landscapes that she was depicting in an abstract fashion. So sort of conceptually in the dips and valleys between the canvases where they come together, we get a sense of dips and valleys and similar features of a natural landscape that are coming into play here in this piece. Moving into the 1970s now, Anne Madden continues to be inspired by her Irish heritage and inspired by the landscape around her and that she experienced growing up. But this inspiration moves out of simply the natural landscape and into features of the landscape, such as the megalithic stone tombs that are so ubiquitous throughout Ireland. Madden was inspired by these tombs to create a series of monumental paintings that explore themes of loss, mourning, and memory. Specifically, she was inspired by the menhirs, which were standing stones that are large, man-made, and upright, and typically date from about the Bronze Age period. They can be found individually as monoliths or part of a group of similar stones. Their sizes can vary considerably, but they're generally uneven and squared and often taper towards the top, which we get a sense of in the abstract forms on this canvas here, which is a part of Anne Madden's Megalith series. It's Megalith series number 4. So we see her now not only, again, being inspired by the landscape, but being inspired by ancestral and ancient sites. And we see this inspiration becoming a way for her to play with the articulation of light, color, and form. So we see her continuing to play with deeply saturated colors. This time it's purple, reddish, blue tones, as well as the abstracted forms that we can see in the outlines of the menhir shapes that are on either side of the canvas there in white. And in referencing these ancient structures and in doing so, sort of referencing the way that different scholars, artists, and thinkers have thought about these sites throughout the history of time, is from the time that they've been discovered, we'll say. Not only is she connecting us and connecting herself to Irish heritage, but also sort of connecting us to the unfathomable magnitude of the cosmos, the sort of mysteries of the universe. Looking at the universe as even a woven text, a web of particles, and the idea that space and time are inseparable, which are all ideas that she sort of starts to begin to grapple with more deeply at this point. It's thought that these megalithic series from the 1970s was also perhaps a response to the violence in Northern Ireland, at least on some level, subconscious if not conscious, as most of the most abstract Irish painters at this time were heavily relying on a darker color palette. We see a lot more use of the color black around this time, and then specifically looking at Madden's Megalith and Menhir series, these are some of the most dark and somber colors that we see in her artistic oeuvre, which seem to contain this sort of brooding, pent-up, sorrowful nature of history and Irish history in particular in their abstract geography, and this sort of link to what was happening in the present time as well. Moving into the 1980s now, we see that Anne Madden becomes inspired by yet another remnant from our ancient past. So this is a quote from Anne Madden now, and she says, "When I felt I was coming to the end of the Megalith series, I introduced a horizontal line at the top of the vertical form, making it an opening. For me, an opening in my painting, as well as an exit from these vertical canvases. These openings, doorways, windows, are metaphors of the artist's vision, as well as openings into possible space, psychic and physical, interior and exterior, of the mind and of matter." So we see Anne Madden here continuing to look to the ancient past as a source of inspiration, and we see this source of inspiration becoming increasingly more enmeshed and embedded in her thinking, not just in terms of applying paint to the canvas, but in the sort of philosophical and metaphysical ideas that she's grappling with in her artwork. Pompeii originally became a source of inspiration for the artist and an interest of hers when she saw a postcard of a wall painting from the city. She was then herself able to visit Pompeii, and it was this visit to Pompeii that moved her deeply. And she said not only was it the evident destruction of the people, but also particular shapes and sensations of the ruined spaces frozen in their time. And so this linked to events in Anne Madden's early life that were marked by a sense of tragedy as well. When she was a teenager, Anne Madden's father passed away in a car crash, and her life, kind of from this point onward, started to be marked by these extremely tragic events. Her sister and her brother-in-law also passed away in a plane crash, leaving behind 3 children that Anne Madden became the guardian of as a result. Her brother then died from fatally injuring herself while falling down the stairs at home in an accident, and I believe it was 1984. And this loss of her brother caused her to psychologically retreat into a dark room, and she didn't paint for some time. So she was very affected by these, of course. Of course she was affected by these extremely tragic, horrible events in her family. And we see with the opening series and the works that are inspired by Pompeii, her starting to kind of work out and grapple with these tragic events from her own history. And it's thought that these tragic events in Anne Madden's life are one of the things that draws her to things like Greek mythology, to sites like Pompeii, and all these sorts of significant events that are a part of the history of the world, really. In writing about her own loss and experiences of tragedy, she says that they stay with you. She says, "It's all still there. I don't know what life is like without all that, but tragedy does live with you. It goes along with you. You don't get rid of it." So we see her starting to use her paintings and her abstract canvas as a way of working through these ideas, thoughts, feelings. So also in the 1980s, kind of following the time of her brother's tragic accident, she dispenses with painting for a long time in favor of drawing, and at this time she produces a number of large works in graphite as well. And eventually, when we see Anne Madden moving back into painting, these influences kind of linger for a while. So this work in particular that we're looking at, which is part of the Hugh Lane Gallery's collection, is called Pompeian Opening 7, number 14. I suppose marking the number that it is in the series, and it's a work of oil and graphite on paper. So we see her kind of blending her period of working in graphite and working on paper, but now starting to introduce oil painting back into the mix. Also, in terms of looking to the past to have an idea about the future, another thing that Anne Madden herself has said about these paintings is that she feels that the incident of Pompeii could be a foretaste of what nuclear holocaust might be like. So she's looking at this site as almost a cautionary tale to our future and to the effects and the problem of climate change. Another quote from her reads, "Pompeii seized hold of my imagination because of its apocalyptic end. It is both a memory and a mirror, a sort of condensation of our possible end by a nuclear holocaust. People and dogs seized and held in death in their everyday gestures, a whole city snuffed out as it went about its business, a door that closed. It lay buried for 19 centuries under 20 meters of lava, and when it was excavated, it revealed itself mainly in the form of doorways and windows. All the roofs were gone." We've now reached sort of Madden's oeuvre for the period of the 1990s, so we can return to the painting that is the topic of today's conversation today, Icarus Plummet, which was painted in 1997. 1997 was also the year that saw Anne Madden having her first solo exhibition in the Hugh Lane Gallery, which was her exhibition called Trajectories. The Icarus painting was a part of this exhibition. It's a part of two sequences of paintings depicting the mythology of the Odyssey and the Icarus story as well. So one sequence of paintings for each of those stories. In this painting, again, we see a very rich color palette. And in these sequences of paintings of the Odyssey and Icarus series, we see Anne Madden using gold for the first time. So this was a recent development for her. In Plummet, we only see this use of gold come into the canvas in a very sort of minute way. The gold is surface bound. It creates a balance and tension between the surface of the color and the depths, which create a limitless expanse of the sky and its vivid blues and azure and ultramarine, super saturated colors through which we see the figure of Icarus again falling to his demise. As mentioned earlier, here we see Anne Madden using a sense of form, of light, and of color to evoke a sense of place and of energy. Although the canvas is, for the most part, saturated in hues of blue, we see from the rapid brushstrokes that surround the figure of Icarus and then sort of dissipate as we reach the top and ends of the canvas, as well as the almost white and gold streak of Icarus plummeting to his demise, giving us a sense of place and a sense of energy and motion. That is the motion of the plummet. I also want to take this time in this instance of looking at Icarus Plummet to talk a little bit about the ground in the painting, or the background specifically, because for Anne Madden, one of her concerns as a painter is that the ground, what we might think of as the background, has always been as important as the figure that is in the foreground, or whatever figure the canvas contains. It's important. It's an important part of the overall composition. The picture plane becomes of importance for the artist here. And this would, of course, be perhaps easier to see if you were to visit this canvas in person, which hopefully we will be able to do in the near future, but I'll just try to describe it for you now. So if you were to look closely at this canvas, and even if you zoomed in to the image on your screen, you might notice the series of quick, rapid brush strokes that characterize the blue, and especially these darker blue areas that surround the figure of Icarus. This application of paint animates the entire surface of the canvas. We see texture like waves in the ocean, as though it's perhaps a view from a bird's eye as we watch Icarus's plummet, or conversely, we could also view it as though one were passing over a vast body of water by airplane. So for my interpretation, you get a reference both to the sky and to the sea, so kind of the meeting of these two celestial bodies that we see Icarus plummeting from one down into the other. And it's this quest and this idea for adventure and discovery that we see played out across the canvas. And it was perhaps this mythological desire to transcend existing limits, to transcend one's limitations and search for new experiences that maybe is part of what found sympathy with the artist and gave her and provided a source of inspiration in this particular story. As many of us probably know, I'll just quickly reiterate kind of the idea of the story, but it's that Icarus, in the ecstasy of flight and against warnings from his father, flies too near to the sun, the wax from his wings melting and causing him to plunge to his death in the eponymous Icarian Sea in the Aegean section of the eastern Mediterranean. So again, just to kind of reiterate the basic form of the mythology of Icarus, it is that Icarus's father Daedalus was an inventor, and he invented two sets of wings for himself and for his son Icarus. They were constructed of feathers that were held together with wax, and in putting on these wings, Daedalus and his son Icarus were able to escape the servitude that Daedalus was bound by, and we'll talk more about that in just a bit. But they were able to sort of escape their circumstances and their confinement through flight. However, it was this ecstasy of flight and this sense of freedom that ultimately drives Icarus to fly too close to the sun, almost as a moth to the flame, and in flying too close to the sun, his wings are melted and he plummets to earth and ultimately to his demise. So looking now at a couple other works from the Icarus series in conjunction with Icarus Plummet, we see here that we have Anne Madden exploring a space that's somewhere between representation and abstraction. So we get the hints in certain canvases, this comes across more than others, of the representation of the bird-like figures of Icarus and Daedalus as they're in flight, but there's also very much an abstract approach to the canvases as well. And we see, in addition to the mythology, Anne Madden's also just really interested in the autonomy of paint and manipulating it into extremely vibrant, color-saturated artworks. And we see that she's playing with an imaginative and an emotional response to ideas of place and memory, to symbols that we're all familiar with, and the complexity of the natural order of things, and what I would say is sort of the natural tragedy of human existence. So taking a look at the canvas on the right of the screen now, which is called Immolation, here we have Icarus dismembered as all of his feathers have fallen across the golden sun, which is that golden sphere that we see in the background, and the light of the sun becomes triumphant sort of in Icarus's demise. And I just wanted to point to this one because I think it's a really great example also of Anne Madden's use of gold and playing with these sort of abstract forms to deal with these mythological ideas and also these philosophical ideas. Also, just another quick note about the artist's sort of working process and this idea of the several different series and repetitions of different themes that we see. We almost see her grappling with them decade by decade, which is kind of what I've taken us through in our talk today. So in having these sort of repeating sequences of images, triptychs, diptychs, series, etc., not only is she sort of serializing a theme and using this idea of relocation as kind of grappling with these ideas, but it's also useful in terms of her artistic process. So Anne Madden would work on more than one canvas at a time, and she would apply the paint very quickly so that she could sort of move between multiple canvases. And so this would also naturally sort of lend to this idea of having series or multiples of one theme, because you can meditate and ruminate on the same sorts of ideas working across multiple pieces. Another reference that we might notice from Anne Madden's artistic oeuvre, and particularly from the Icarus series and Icarus Plummet in particular, is the influence of the Mediterranean, of the Aegean, of that dark blue of the ocean. And so something that is notable about Anne Madden and Louis Le Brocquy's history and their artistic oeuvre is that, as I mentioned earlier, they spent the majority of their life and raised their children in the south of France. And one of the reasons that they moved to France was because Anne Madden was advised to live in a warmer climate than Ireland due to the damage to her spine and the hope that she'd be able to make a better recovery if she was living in a warmer climate. So Anne Madden and Louis Le Brocquy continued to visit Ireland frequently and to be very much involved in the Irish art scene, though they weren't physically located there. And Anne Madden continued to exhibit with the Irish Exhibition of Living Art, for example, while she was based in France. While in France, however, they were able to live sort of the lifestyle that we might think of when we think of, successful, famous artists. She lived a very glamorous life with her husband in the south of France with Louis Le Brocquy. and they were able to raise their children there. They had a villa in the south of France where they made their own olive oil and just brought up their family there. And it seems like it was quite an idyllic time for the two of them, despite the tragedies that marked Anne Madden's life. In addition to being well involved in the Irish art scene, Anne Madden was also particularly involved in the art scenes and movements in France as well. She showed in France frequently, especially after she represented Ireland at the Paris Biennial in 1965. And today we can find works of Anne Madden's in the Musée d'Art Moderne, in the Villa de Paris, in the Pompidou, and in the Picasso Museum. Initially, in fact, Anne Madden was more successful in France than in Ireland, where she was somewhat in Louis Le Brocqui's shadow. But I would say that these days, I think of Anne Madden as being, an extremely significant artist in her own right, who was hugely important to these concepts of and ideas of modern art in Ireland. So, as I said, after living in the south of France with Louis Le Brocqui for approximately 30 years, they returned to Dublin. They had raised their children in the south of France, and when that was sort of over and done with, they did make the decision to return more or less permanently to Dublin. However, before they returned to Dublin, or right around this time rather, Anne Madden was commissioned to paint an extremely large canvas, I believe her largest canvas to date, for the Centre International d'Art Contemporain, which was located in the village of Carros in the south of France, where Anne Madden and Louis Le Brocqui lived. So we see their villa there on the upper left side of the screen, and then just next to it on the right side of the screen is this large canvas, which is called Imperius, that Anne Madden painted for the villa in France in their village. On the lower left side of the screen, also, we see what I believe is Imperius laid out on the floor, and we see Anne Madden continuing to work sort of in this fashion where the canvas is on the ground and she kind of is able to work with it in that way. And then, of course, the facade of the building that Imperius is located in is on the lower right side of the screen. And the creation of this piece, in addition to the relocation, marked a major juncture in Anne Madden's personal and professional life. This canvas is 54 square meters large, so it's an extremely large canvas, and it's permanently installed in an intimate vaulted room in the chateau. Like Icarus Plummet and many paintings from the Icarus series, it's also a rich, deep blue color, and we have a ball of gold at the center, against which the profile of a figure with outstretched winged arms can be discerned. So she's still grappling with the Icarus mythology in this work as well. The canvas is installed, as you can sort of make out from that picture on the upper right hand of the screen there. It's installed onto the ceiling of the chateau, and this installation allows the canvas to become illuminated by the morning sun, which inflames the golden hearth of the opening, deepening the blue, allowing the winged figure to appear to be hovering overhead. And one final note about this piece is that its title, Imperius, is also a reference to the idea of a celestial and fiery core from which all existence and faith springs. So again, we see her kind of looking at and thinking about these archetypal ideas. Very quickly, I also just wanted to show a look of the interiors of Anne Madden and Louis Le Brocqui's terraced home in Portobello, just because I thought it was interesting to get a little insight into their kind of more private spaces. And I think that these photos are just a really interesting example of the space they inhabited and the way that they filled it with art. And we see the art of Anne Madden and of Louis Le Brocqui and also of their friends kind of scattered throughout the spaces. These photos are taken from the gloss.ie, so the website of the magazine, and so you're welcome to look it up on your own time, but it is a really interesting sort of separate insight into the more intimate side of their lives. So moving on now, I thought we would start to wrap up our conversation today by taking a look at some of Anne Madden's most recent paintings, and I believe her most recent exhibition, which was also at the Hewlane Gallery in 2017, and this exhibition was called Colors of the Wind, Ariadne's Thread. It took inspiration both from the natural phenomenon of the aurora borealis, or the northern lights, as well as inspiration from the Greek myth of Ariadne. So for the purposes of our conversation today, I'll focus more on the Ariadne myth and the references and things that we see in that. So just to briefly sort of summarize the myth of Ariadne, Ariadne was the daughter of King Minos of Crete, and she was tasked with overseeing the construction of a labyrinth. The labyrinth itself was designed by Daedalus, who we looked at earlier in the Icarus series, and was created in order to contain the Minotaur. The Minotaur was Ariadne's half-brother, who was given birth to by her mother Pasiphae, the wife of King Minos. And as we know, the Minotaur was a creature who had the head of a bull and the body of a man. And so this structure was built to contain this wild beast. After King Minos led Crete to the defeat of the Athenians, they were required to relinquish 7 young males and 7 virgin females every 9 years to be sacrificed to the Minotaur or lost forever in the labyrinth, because the labyrinth, as we know, was a sort of an insolvable inescapable maze structure. So it both contained the Minotaur and also became a prison for the Athenians that were sent to it. So on the left-hand side of the screen here, we have Anne Madden's Cabinet's Labyrinth, which is, of course, an abstract depiction of the labyrinth. And on the right side of the screen, we have Anne Madden's Ariadne, which is an abstract depiction of the character of Ariadne, and I would say also an abstract depiction of Ariadne's thread. So where the thread comes into play here is that Theseus, who is a Greek hero, arrived to slay the Minotaur, and Ariadne fell in love with Theseus. And so she gave him this golden thread so that he could take it with him into the labyrinth and use it to find his way out again, which was successful. Ultimately, Theseus slays the Minotaur, finds his way out of the labyrinth, and Theseus and Ariadne escape together, although Theseus ultimately abandons Ariadne. I think it's like the next day, more or less, in the middle of the night while she's sleeping. However, sort of true to the themes of Greek mythology, as soon as Ariadne awakes, she is discovered by the Greek god Dionysius, who is, the god of wine and revelry and all of that, and he becomes taken with her, and the story continues from there. But this is sort of the parameters of the story that are often focused on by artists when we're talking about the Ariadne myth. In fact, most paintings depicting Ariadne, and there are many of these, focus either on the moment when she's abandoned by Theseus while she's sleeping, or in the moment when she's quote-unquote discovered by Dionysius when she wakes. So Anne Madden's depiction of Ariadne and her triptych that we're looking at on the right-hand side of the screen here is unique, in all of her depictions of Ariadne and of these mythologies are unique in that they don't focus on these elements, on these sort of damsel in distress type elements, and rather they focus on Ariadne, and she's focusing on Ariadne and personifying her as the solution itself, as the way that Theseus is able to slay the Minotaur and escape the labyrinth. So further from just displaying in an abstract way the story, the myth of Ariadne, we also see, of course, Anne Madden starting to grapple with larger philosophical themes and ideas here. We can view the labyrinth as the archetypical idea of the psyche, and Ariadne's thread as a process of negotiating the psychological darkness in order to seek enlightenment. This is a sort of philosophical problem that thinkers and philosophers have kind of grappled with, in using the metaphor of Ariadne's thread as multiple ways of finding a solution to a problem, multiple ways of working things out. So this is sort of a common representation of complex forms of analysis and multiple ways at arriving at a solution. So for Anne Madden, this comes across in the sense of one grappling with light and dark and inner demons and finding the lightness in darkness, which of course is also reflective of her own personal history that we've talked about here today. So looking now at these two canvases, Minos and Light and Dark, which depict the figure of the Minotaur, we can think about this idea of light and darkness and grappling with these things, and we might reflect on this quote from Anne Madden about this series of work in which she says, "It's all to do really with how to get the bad side out of us. Is the light going to take away the darkness? It's all to do with light and darkness. The Minotaur who lurks in some of the paintings says a lot about us as humans." So again, we see her sort of grappling with these ideas and also coming to terms with her own personal grief. So also just to say, as a note, Louis Le Brocq, he passed away in 2012 from Alzheimer's at the age of 95. So this would have been 4 or 5 years before Ann Madden made these paintings. So I think we can rightfully say that she's maybe grappling with some of these ideas and feelings in these canvases as well. And speaking of this time, she described it as an agonizing time period, seeing what happened to him, which made it was agonizing for him, and that made it agonizing for her. But she said that there's nothing you can do except get through it. This is a quote from her now. I think time does help. It somehow sort of makes you understand that it has happened and that's it. You want him back. You want to die yourself, but you go on. I suppose my work helps me, really. So we see in her kind of reflecting on this time in her life, maybe some other connections to the Ariadne story and mythology, as well as a sense of loss and grieving, but also having to move on from it. And we also, in these works, as we move forward, into the 21st century, we see Ann Madden, as she was in the Pompeian opening series, continue to grapple with a fear, really, of climate change and the catastrophic damage that it can cause. So one thing that Ann Madden has said that the Minotaur symbolizes for her is conflict, catastrophic climate change, and their human consequences, including things like starvation and displacement. So the thread here, which we can see hovering over the Minotaur on the painting on the left-hand side of the screen, Minos, here represents a metaphorical solution in the light that kills the dark. So coming to some sort of solution to grapple with these issues of our time. So coming full circle now to take one final look at the Icarus Plummet canvas, we might note again also the relationship between the Ariadne's Thread series and this earlier series that depicted the story of Icarus. As I mentioned earlier, the labyrinth that the Minotaur is imprisoned within was built by Daedalus, who was the father of Icarus, while he was imprisoned by Pasiphae and Minos. So he had to build this, he was sort of forced to build this labyrinth, and because he was a great inventor, he was able to do so. Also because he was a great inventor, he was able to invent the wings that ultimately give himself and his son Icarus their freedom, but also tragically lead to Icarus's demise. And so in this sense, for Ann Madden, I would say that Icarus is a symbol of this, idea of hubris. So of having, perhaps too much pride in oneself and the folly of overweening or over coddling or overextending or overexerting perhaps one's own ambitions. So also, if we were to look at the myths that Ann Madden chooses to grapple with in her painting specifically, so Icarus, the Odyssey, and Ariadne, and the Minotaur, we might also notice that they share this sort of transitional existence of an endeavor ever in progress. So this idea of somebody being in the act of solving or grappling with something, and this sort of lends itself in an abstract way, or in terms of philosophy, to the existential process of painting. And we might look at these canvases with mythological inspirations as sort of symbolizing a journey in paint. So rather than beginning with knowing exactly what she wants to paint, Ann Madden, as an artist, part of her process, begins with more of a general idea of what she wants to say on a canvas rather than a particular image. And as the painting progresses, we see her struggling with the subject matter, with her ideas, with everything that we've talked about here today, and using paint almost to come to a resolution. And this is what Ann Madden calls the painting itself, so kind of coming into fruition almost on its own terms, but of course assisted by the artist hand, which again links us back to abstract expressionism and abstract painting and these sort of metaphysical ideas about the artist and their interaction with the paint and the canvas and their materials. Like many abstract artists, for Ann Madden, painting is a sort of meditation. It's a form of thinking. And just to close here, I'll leave you with a quote by Brian O'Doherty again of Ann Madden's particular form of painting. And he says, for her, for meditation, no matter how swirling her thoughts and or paint, is a prime requirement. A projection of self into the darker waters where the twin gods of Madden's universe, nature and self, undergo strange reciprocal exchanges, offer various complexions to each other, a kind of magic mirroring at the center of her project, which has never paused for long to admire its products but must always, always move forward, an impetus from which works are not so much delivered as flung off with an almost physical gesture. So this concludes today's coffee conversation. I wanted to thank you all so much for tuning in today and for joining in, I suppose, on our conversation with Ann Madden, who I think is a really interesting artist who is continuing to evolve and continuing to grapple with these same sorts of ideas and themes throughout her artwork. So yeah, thanks so much for tuning in. And for more information on gallery openings and closures and upcoming events, you can visit our website at huelane.ie, and specifically for our programs, you can visit huelane.ie/education. Thank you.